All right, guys, so all the parts for the elevator have been prepped, they've been primed, and so today I start the process of putting the elevator together in its final assembly. So I may have found the secret to making all of the deburring and the prep and the pre-coat and the scuffing and all that not such an awful process after all. It involves a portable air conditioner for the garage and a bit of an entertainment upgrade as well. Also, I found kind of a good process when it comes to working and prepping all the small parts, scuffing those up, hitting them with a pre-coat solution. What I had been doing is taking everything outside the garage, because you've got to apply the solution, then you've got to hose it all back off. What I did instead this time is I set myself up inside for all the small parts. I had 2 buckets filled with water. One of those was the kind of initial rinse, and that got pretty soapy after a while, but then you take it to the other bucket for a final rinse. So I was able to do all of the small parts, all the rib pieces, all the small components, anything pretty much that you could dunk in a bucket. I did that way. And then for the larger pieces, I was able to open the garage door, move the table over there, but the best part about a portable air conditioner is you can move it wherever you want it. So I just kind of put that right behind me. And then as you see here, if you stand just right, you can actually get the air to just kind of inflate your shirt and keep you cool while you're working on that. So that was kind of a nice plus. Plus I got to watch football while I was doing all that too. So that was nice. I guess that's my tip for your workshop. All right, so let's get busy putting the elevator together. So picking up where I left off in the plans, the next step after everything's been all primed is to go ahead and rivet the little nut plates onto the bottom of this access panel for the trim tab servo. So let's get started on that.
The trim tab servo is an electric motor which allows you to move the trim tab from the cockpit during flight. It's housed back here in the elevator and may need maintenance over time. So to make it accessible, we make this access door which is held in place by screws. For this reason, I'm riveting nut plates to the frame of the panel which will accept the screws for the access panel door.
There it is. So next up, starting to build a little bit of the internal skeleton for the elevator. So that's got your front spars and the parts for the tip ribs that are going to go out there. We'll start riveting that part of everything together, and then we'll start working with the ribs.
The first step is riveting the 2 halves of each tip rib assembly together. I'm using a flange nose yoke here to allow me to reach over the flanges of each half. It's a little tricky in that you have to open up the piston to fit over both flanges and then tighten it down to close up the gap to set the rivet. So you basically have to leave the squeezer attached to the parts, then work your way around the edges setting all the rivets, and then open the piston back up to remove the squeezer when you're done. With that part complete, I can move on to attaching these spar doublers to each spar and also attach their corresponding nut plates. These are where bolts will go through, which will actually attach the elevator to the horizontal stabilizer. And then once that process is complete, the next step is to go ahead and rivet the completed tip rib assemblies onto the end of each spar. And then finally I attach the root ribs to each end of the spars. With the skeletal structure of the front spar assembly pretty much complete, one of the last steps in that process is to go ahead and wrap the tip ribs in their skin. To set the rivets in this part and make sure everything runs flush all the way aft, the instructions call for setting the rivets at the front first and then work your way back, alternating with the top and bottom rivets all the way back toward the end of the skin.
So the left and right halves of the elevator skeletons are done. We've got the tip ribs on there, the root ribs are attached to everything, and we've got the skin put on the outside here. So the next stuff to work on is going ahead and attaching the elevator horns into their position. So that'll be coming up next. And then from there we move on to take all the rib pieces, start attaching that to the skins, we'll back rivet those in place, and then everything gets attached. So moving on from there, taking a break for today, and I'll pick it back up tomorrow. So next step is to go ahead and attach these elevator horns. These are where the control cables will actually attach to allow you to move the elevator. So I've got them clecoed in place, and now it's just a matter of setting 12 rivets, and then we'll move on from there. So made a little bit of a mistake. For the inside of the trim tabs, you want to mask off the area where these little foam ribs are going to go, because those are going to get glued down in place, so you don't want any primer in those areas. So I masked those off just like the instructions called for, did all that fine. But what I forgot about is that I was supposed to do the same thing on the inside of the skins as well, and I didn't do that. So I ended up priming the whole inside of both of those. So what I'm doing now is not really the end of the world. Just gonna go back and mask off the areas where all those guys are gonna go. And then you just take some Scotch-Brite, and it's pretty easy to get it right back down to bare metal. So. Just a little bit of extra added time because I didn't mask it off like I should have. What are you gonna do?
Also, I learned that if you put a little bit of acetone on the Scotch-Brite pad, it takes the primer off with even less effort.
So when we did the initial assembly, you may have wondered why we separated the ribs only to then put the ribs back together. And when we did the initial assembly on these, we clecoed both halves of the rib together and then put the skin together all around that and closed it up and did the test fit on it. But the reason these are separate is because what we do in the final assembly is we actually take and attach half of the rib to the rear spar. These ribs will then get back riveted to one half of the skin, and then the other half will get back riveted to the other half of the skin, and then the two halves get mated together, and that's when the two halves of the ribs get rejoined back together. So, slightly different process, and that's why you separate these in the first place. So at this point I've got the ribs clecoed onto the rear spar. I'm going to go ahead and rivet those together. We'll do the same thing with the other side, and then the next step after that is to start back riveting all this stuff onto the skin so we can join them up.
So setting these rivets was a little bit tricky because of the flange and how far up in there one side of the rivet is. So I found the best approach to this was to put the cup set on the piston itself, That way I could close up the piston enough to where the cup set was just sitting flush on the rivet head, and about the same time the flat set was resting on the bottom of it, and then make sure everything was all nice and centered, and once I was sure that it was, then I could hit the final squeeze on it. Because of the spacing in there, you had to move the piston in order to make contact with the round head of the rivet. So you just had to kind of take your time and line it up before you finally set that rivet. With both of the rear spar rib assemblies complete, the next step is to attach the left one to the top skin of the left elevator half, and then attach the right assembly to the bottom skin of the right elevator half. In addition to clecoing the top skin to the assembly, the left side also gets the forward half of the trim tab hinge attached in this step. Now with everything clecoed in place, I begin to set the rivets. Where the trim tab will go, I can easily access the rivets along the rear spar using a squeezer. However, in the last few feet of the left half, as well as the entire trailing edge of the right elevator half, these will have to be bucked. The rear spar in this step has been clamped to the table, so it's a little tricky getting access for the bucking bar, as well as being able to see what you're doing under there. But if you take your time, it all works out okay.
All right, so the top skin on the left side of the airplane has been riveted to its rear spar. The next step with that is to turn that over, back rivet all of the ribs to that. Similarly, on the right side, we've got the bottom skin, which has been riveted to its rear spar. And again, we'll flip that over and we'll back rivet all the ribs onto that and move on from there. All right, so that's got the top skin for the left side of the elevator. That's been riveted to its ribs into the rear spar. We did the same thing over there for the bottom skin on the right side of the elevator. So the next step is to put the ribs on the other halves of each skin, and then those will get put together. And then we've got some slightly different riveting involved to attach the rear spar to the other side of the skins, because as you can see, there's a lot of material here that extends beyond the spar itself. So there's no way to use a normal bucking bar up in there. Your hand's just not going to quite get up in there. So Vans has you make kind of a special bucking bar to make that happen. They give you the plans on the dimensions and everything to have this machined, or you can just go online and buy one, which is what I did. So this is specially designed for the RV14. And what this is going to let you do basically is get right back in here behind the rivet. You get the top skin on here on top, and then you've got a nice bucking surface up underneath that you can then rivet against. So that should provide a pretty stable surface to rivet against. We'll see how that goes.
With the larger half of the ribs riveted to one half of the skins, the next step, of course, is to back rivet the other half of the rib to the other half of the skins. The doubler for the trim tab access door also gets riveted to the bottom of the left skin as well, along with this reinforcement doubler brace, which completes the compartment to eventually house the control motor for the trim tab.
All right, so that finishes riveting all the ribs to both the front and back sides of the skins for each side of the airplane. So now rivets go in that will join up the two halves of the ribs and bring the whole thing together.
Once again, it's pretty tight working in there, pulling the blind rivets, but it's really important to take your time here and make sure that you set them flush, because it would be really hard if you had to get in there and drill one of these out. Now it's time to rivet the other half of the skins to the rear spar. As I mentioned, this is where the special bucking bar comes into play. I thought this might seem a little awkward, but in reality, it works really well. I think in some ways I actually like it better than just holding a bucking bar, because you don't feel all that vibration in your hand, and you don't get your hand pinched in a tight spot or that kind of thing. The only issue with this is that the whole assembly will kind of want to drift away from you a little as the rivet gun fires. So to stop that, I just braced the back of it with some wood, and that took care of the problem. So the left half of the elevator bucked successfully with the specialized little bucking bar. Moving on now to the right half of that. But yeah, it's pretty simple. It fits up in there as advertised. I put some tape on the back side of this to keep it from scratching the inside. But yeah, went a lot easier than I thought. Thought it might be a little bit tricky, but it's not. So that's good. Moving on. And then the next major step is to take the front spar assemblies. Those big clecoed here in place. We start riveting all that stuff together. And then the last kind of major step after that is to go ahead and close up the trailing edges of it. That's a little bit of an involved process. It involves some tank sealant that goes there in the back of that. So we'll do that to close everything up. Then the leading edges get rolled, and then we've got some stuff to do as far as getting the trim tab motor inserted and wired up and all that. So making good progress getting near to the end on this. Keep moving on. After clecoing the front spar to the internal ribs, the next step before riveting anything else is to also cleco the skins to the root ribs and the flange of the front spar. With that complete, the front spar is riveted to the ribs using blind rivets. The instructions for riveting the skins follow a very specific sequence, which has you leave rivets out in several areas. And as you'll see, this allows you to open up some areas to set some internal rivets during this final assembly. Here I'm reaching in to set the rivets in these corner gussets. Blind rivets are used here to secure the reinforcement doubler brace for the trim tab motor compartment. And with that complete, I can go ahead and set the remaining rivets in the rear spar, as well as the rivets to close up the skin to the root rib. From there I move on to rivet the skins, where they cover the counterbalance tip ribs on each end. The top rivets are accessed by opening up the skins at each end, and the bottom skins will use blind rivets for this, as there's no other way to get in there to set those rivets. Finally, the flanges on the front spars are riveted to the skins, and any remaining rivets at the ends are also closed up, with the exception of the last 3 at each end. These are left out for now to allow for access to install the trailing edge ribs and the trailing edges. They will then also be closed up with blind rivets once the trailing edges are closed. All right, well, that completes the bulk of the assembly on both halves of the elevators now. The only thing remaining now is to kind of close up the trailing edges, and then I've got some work on the trim tab itself that I still need to do. Trailing edge on this side. But I think that's something I'm going to do tomorrow. This was a lot of work getting all this part of it done, but it went really well, so I'm pretty happy with the results. I'll pick it up tomorrow. So the process here is basically take the trailing edge piece, prep that with some alcohol to make sure it's nice and clean. And then what we'll do is we'll put the 3M adhesive tape on both sides of this and leave the outer coating still on there, the cover. Then I'll remove the coating from the bottom half, and I will cleco that in place to the bottom of that trailing edge.
And then I just leave it clecoed. And they want that to sit overnight, and that'll just give that adhesive time on the bottom half of this to set up nicely before we move on from there. Once that's done, then you open this back up, and that's when we'll put those foam ribs inside with the tank sealant, and then we'll put a board on that with some weight on it, and then that gets to sit for several days. And then the next step is you come back, you remove the top strip of the adhesive from the trailing edge piece, and then cleco all that back down, and then rivet it in place and close the whole thing up. All right, so I'll let those set up overnight, and I'll get to work on the trim tab.
So I'll end this video here as it's already starting to run a little bit long. When I pick up in the next video, I'll complete the assembly of the elevators, which will include inserting the trailing edge ribs with tank sealant, completing the assembly of the trim tab itself, riveting the trailing edges closed, rolling the leading edges, installation and wiring of the trim tab motor, and finally installing the counterbalance weights. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying the video, please give it a like. That really helps out the channel. And subscribe if you're not already. We'll see you on the next video.